CBS News. In 10 hours, the record 10-day mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia is scheduled to be history. The shuttle, with a $1 billion space lab in its cargo hold, is to set down on a desert lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base, California, at 7:59 a.m. Pacific time. Weather prospects are good, except for some occasional displays of testiness from members of the 6-man crew when they felt they were being pushed too hard by NASA, and some technical problems. The mission has been essentially free of major flaws. Flight Director Chuck Lewis extolled the positive attitude of all involved over the years.
This can-do attitude and people working to achieve excellent results, I think, is what makes them work. And there's been, over the 20 years or so since Mercury, there's been thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans that's participated directly or indirectly, and now we've got some of our European friends participating with us. And if I, at the risk of sounding a little melodramatic, I think there's thousands of people that have some of that right kind of stuff that has been discussed here in the last few weeks.
More in a moment.
CBS News, I'm Vicki Kelly. Shuttle Columbia is getting ready to come home. They are switching off instruments and have already shut down the $1 billion European-built space lab. The Columbia is scheduled to land in about 7 hours at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
CBS News, I'm Charles Osgood. The final is nearing the end of its record 10-day mission. Touchdown is about 4 hours from now. Jackie Judd has the latest from Houston.
Space Lab is locked up tight. The scientists shut down its systems, then they floated through the tunnel, connected to Columbia's front section, and closed the hatch. The rest of this mission is in the hands of pilot Brewster Shaw and Commander John Young.
Well, Houston, the orbiter just chugged along on 10.5 kW. What machine? We copy, John. We can
Apparently, because the blue team, which worked the day shift, was asleep. By now, everyone is awake and making final preparations for the landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Shaw and Young will then fly here to Houston for family reunions. The 4 Space Lab scientists remain at Edwards to be guinea pigs for 1 more week. Space adaptation tests will be repeated to find out how well the crew is readjusting to Earth's environment. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
Hoping for some further word soon, but flight controllers here at the Johnson Space Center are trying to analyze very quickly, the best they can, what has suddenly gone wrong with 2 general-purpose computers on board Columbia. There are 5 computers on board the orbiter, a primary computer, and 4 general-purpose computers, 2 of which are desperately needed for re-entry. And that's all they have now. NASA's Mission Control Boy Steve Nesbitt explained the problem.
Failures on GPC 1 and 2. He said at that time they appeared to be associated with chest pains, or it's uncertain as to how those 2 may relate. We will be attempting to get some data from those computers at the earliest opportunity and analyze that to determine what the situation is.
So far, attempts to reacquire communication have not been successful, although we expect that any moment now. We are less than 3 hours away from the scheduled deorbit ignition of the 3 big maneuvering engines, a process that will eventually result in the landing of Columbia, scheduled right now for 9:59 Houston time. And let me point out that there is only one good landing opportunity today at the Edwards Air Force Base in California, the dry lake bed, where they would like to land the shuttle because it's going to weigh 22,000 pounds when it comes in. Right now, though, the landing is still on, although this computer problem needs to be fixed quickly. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
The mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia wraps up later this morning. Jackie Judd's been covering it from blastoff. Jackie, what's going to be the legacy of this mission?
I think the legacy, Rob, is that it opened a new phase in space research. What NASA ultimately wants to do is have a manned space station permanently orbiting in space. And this was sort of the proving ground for that theory. Now, there will be many more Space Lab missions before we get to that point, but I think that this was intended to prove any skeptics wrong.
I read somewhere that this mission produced some 2 trillion pieces of scientific data. Just the enormity of the amount of information is a story.
You're right about that. In a single second, Spacelab returned enough information to fill 18,000 books. In one 50-minute period, we were told, it generated enough information to reach from the Earth to the Moon. Now, the scientists who had experiments on Spacelab had been receiving all of this data back, but there is large quantities of data that are still on Spacelab. So these scientists are very anxiously awaiting its return. And it will take some of these scientists just a couple of months to figure out what this all means. Others, though, it will take up to a decade to research and to figure out, as I say, what the information may mean to them and ultimately mean to us.
Jackie, this is the first joint European-American space venture. Is that turning out to be a happy marriage?
Very happy indeed. There was a lot of skepticism from the European community because, of course, that is who footed the bill. Spacelab cost $1 billion. There were some delays in getting it up, as you know. But the European scientist who was the chief spokesman during this mission to the media said he felt it was a very happy marriage, that the skeptics should be silenced by what's come out of this.
Jackie Judd at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Now this.
The holidays. Time for family, friends, and home. One of the best parts of the holidays at home is home box office.
Is critical for this morning's reentry. Twice in the past hour, Columbia's fired its rocket thrusters to adjust its orbital attitude, and twice when they did that, the computers failed on board. There are 4 general-purpose computers, a 5th backup. One of the 2 computers that has failed has apparently been brought back online, although we don't know for sure because communications have been quiet for a long time. The second, though, maybe failed for good, and until Mission Control understands what's gone wrong, there may not be a decision on landing. Let me try to explain to the folks what this situation is. Picture yourself driving down the street in your car with your hands on the steering wheel. Every time you start to veer out of one lane, you use your steering wheel to get back. Well, they used rocket thrusters on board Columbia, and right now, since those computers are not working, they have taken their hands in a sense off the steering wheel, and Columbia is in fact drifting in orbit. With the payload doors still open and the orbit ignition less than 2.5 hours away, Mission Control Steve Nesbitt says time is getting critical.
With the time situation being what it is, 2 hours, 44 minutes away from deorbiting. And at the time where we need to get go from mission control for Payload Bay Door closing and all the other preparations. It is approaching the point here where we need to make a decision probably by the pilot station as to whether to proceed or to wave off to another opportunity.
Well, a crowd of tracking and down relay satellite a few moments ago, but there has been no communication from the crew. Obviously, they're busy at work. Orbit 161 is the prime opportunity for landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. There is a possible pass very late in the afternoon, but it is not an effective one. Most likely, if we don't come down this morning, we would come down tomorrow. There is an appeal on board for another day's mission, although some of the systems on board Columbia might have to be powered down. Of course, we'll keep you updated on the problem on board Columbia. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News. The next few minutes or so, but Mission Control has just told the crew of Spacelab right now to stop preparations for the orbit, that the weather is good for a possible landing late this afternoon, although it's not an attractive cross-range opportunity, perhaps for tomorrow. They lost 2 general-purpose computers a short time ago, computers that control navigation and rocket thrusters. So far, they've got one of those computers back, but that's not good enough to come back. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
NASA delays the scheduled landing of the shuttle Columbia because of computer problems aloft. The Russians have stopped the start talks, declining to set a resumption date. Good morning, this is Reed Collins with the CBS World News Roundup. Computer problems have forced a delay in this morning's scheduled return to Earth of the Space Shuttle Columbia. The latest from Houston, Texas, and Jackie Judd.
This morning's landing of Columbia has been postponed until later this afternoon or possibly until tomorrow. The problem, a general-purpose computer, one of 4 on the spacecraft, has failed. The voice of Control, Steve Nesbitt.
We have waved off for this morning landing opportunity due to the problems with the computer system. We have reached a point where we needed to go one way or the other with that decision, and it was not felt that we fully understood enough yet to proceed with the landing opportunity. We have waved off. There will be no ignition in 2 hours.
2 computers are needed for deorbit and 3 are working, but without understanding what caused the breakdown, NASA does not want to risk the landing now. Before this landing, preparations were going smoothly. Spacelab's complex array of equipment had been shut down, and Commander John Young said the ambitious scientific venture could be called a success. We have more on the story from my colleague Chris Glenn at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
All right, go to Edwards. Go.
Significance of the delay here at Edwards. So far, all of the command decisions are coming out of Houston at this point, and there hasn't been much reaction from officials here. The weather, as was noted in the tape you used, is holding good and looks good here for a landing here at Edwards, at least for the next 24 hours. And officials do not seem to be terribly concerned about the safety of the crew or the mission, at least not at this point. Too early to tell what's going to happen, but so far everyone at Edwards is calm. This is Chris Glenn, CBS News, Edwards Air Force Base, California.
And we'll be keeping you abreast of the latest developments aloft. A lot is...
is now slowly rotating in space. Its forward rocket shut down because they apparently triggered the failure on board the orbiter's computers. Mission Control has waved off this morning. They may try to land before sunset in California.
The weather at Edwards is okay for the rest of today's activities, and it'll also be good tomorrow. We currently are thinking along the lines of the descending Rev 165 or 166. If you don't have any sleep problems with that.
The veteran astronaut Young replied, no problems at all. He's remained calm throughout the year, suggesting only that the landing should be tried today if the computer problems can be fixed. Live from the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
To continue with the deorbit prep or not, over. Negative, John.
It could not have happened at a worse time. The crew about to close the big Payload Bay Doors, one of the final steps before beginning their deorbit reparations. They fired the forward rockets to adjust their attitude, and both times some computers on board failed. 3 of the 4 general-purpose computers are working again, but Mission Control still doesn't understand why it happened. And until they do, and they can ensure the rockets will fire on re-entry, they won't start again.
In an attempt to get better data flow to the ground, the crew has been asked to redeploy the KU band antenna.
It appears the weather is good for a landing this afternoon or tomorrow morning. The landing could take place between 4:30 and 6 Houston time. There are 2 orbits they can try it on. But instead of traveling out of orbit from the south to the north, the landing would now be from the north to the south. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News. Have been some jolt. The commander, John Young, telling Mission Control the crew experienced 19 Gs, 8 more than ever experienced on a moon flight, 14 more than the normal G-forces on the shuttle, and 1 less G-force than the shuttle itself is designed to handle. The computers failed when rockets were fired, and the commander, John Young, didn't need anyone to tell him to stop touching things once it happened.
We're not touching anything right now. My feeling is that it was up-fired thrusters that failed both those GPCs, and I don't know how, but it was really an impact type thing, probably a higher magnitude than we've seen around here in a long time, and maybe somebody can look at the thruster traces and say what it was, but it seemed that way. It looks like to me that GPC-1 is hard failed and GPC-2 is okay.
One of the computers is now back online. There are enough to handle a deorbit opportunity late in the afternoon near sunset. But if it's scrubbed again, Columbia will have enough fuel for a landing tomorrow as long as some systems on board are shut down. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Good morning. The Space Shuttle Columbia won't be using the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California for landing. In this live report from the Johnson Space Center, KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino says the landing will be on concrete instead.
As Columbia fired its maneuvering rockets to adjust its attitude 3 hours before its scheduled deorbit ignition, something went drastically wrong. 2 of general-purpose computers on board that control re-entry failed, and it gave the crew members some jolt. 19 Gs, according to the commander, John Young. In his words, dynamics we haven't seen in a very long time. The forces were 14 times greater than ever experienced before on a shuttle flight. Now they're trying to get that computer.
Your data looks good, and we would like you to go ahead and attempt a re-IPL on GPC-1
using SSR8, page 5-75.
Loud and clear. We've already tried to IPL it 3 times. We will try again.
They will land on the concrete instead of the dry lake bed, something that NASA said originally it did not want to do because of its heavy Space Lab cargo. But apparently they'd rather get back sooner than wait until tomorrow. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
NBC News. Good morning. I'm Gary Nunn. Columbia, the space shuttle, will not land as originally scheduled an hour from now at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Computer problems are causing a delay in the landing. The 6 crewmen are in no immediate danger, though. Dan Blackburn is standing by at Edwards. Dan, when is shuttle going to land?
The Columbia could come down this afternoon on either the 165th or 166th revolution at either 2:17 or 3:47 p.m. Pacific time. After that, loss of daylight starts to become a problem. Earlier this morning, 2 of the computers aboard the craft conked out after firing thrusters on the reaction control pod, and there was speculation that the jolt of that firing might have caused the problem. However, experts here say they doubt that because the computers took much sharper jolts during liftoff and are designed to withstand such shocks. Now, one of the 2 problem computers is back online, and the other's been written off as a failure. So they have the equipment for a landing later today, but no decision yet on when or whether. Dan Blackburn, NBC News at Edwards Air Force Base.
More news in a minute.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause. The return of the Space Shuttle Columbia, which had been scheduled for this hour, has been delayed by onboard computer problems. One of the 4 main computers apparently failed just after a jet thruster was fired to start the re-entry procedure. Spaceship Commander John Young was then told by Mission Control in Houston that more time was needed to better understand the problem before ending the flight. Houston officials say there's no need for hurry in getting the Columbia back.
The consumables is excellent, and that the orbiter has a full 2-day wave-off capability. That doesn't mean that we intend to wave off, but that we do have from this point a full 2 days operating capability for wave-off. That would not be a night landing considered, and the primary landing site would remain one we would use, that is Edwards Air Force Base, California.
Weather forecasters at Edwards say conditions for landing look good for later today or tomorrow. If the computer cannot be fixed, NASA says the 3 remaining computers and 1 backup could do the job safely. More CBS News in a moment.
CBS News, I'm Richard C. Hottelet. A computer failure on board the Space Shuttle Columbia caused NASA to postpone this morning's scheduled landing. Jackie Judd reports.
NASA is still investigating what caused the computer to fail, whether it had anything to do with the firing of a primary jet, which John Young said shook the spacecraft. The computer had sent a command for the firing, and then it went down. The general-purpose computer is an IBM product. Justin Fishbein says they're essential to pre-launch, pre-landing, and maneuvering operations.
The functions of the computers are to assist the crews in performing guidance, navigation, and control of the orbiter, and they also help send data about the status of the flight back to Mission Control for use by flight controllers.
Mission Control is still planning for an afternoon landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California, although touchdown tomorrow is a possibility. The crew has enough supplies on board to last until Saturday morning. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause. The Space Shuttle Mission Control has now decided on a new re-entry time for crew and vehicle and reported another malfunction. Jackie Judd has details.
Columbia's return has been pushed back again to give investigators more time to analyze the problems with its navigational equipment and to give Commander John Young, who has been at the controls since last night, a chance for a catnap. Columbia is now scheduled to land at Edwards Air Force Base in California just before 7 tonight Eastern Time, 90 minutes or 1 orbit later than the last scheduled landing. Under investigation is why 1 of 4 computers used to guide the spacecraft during re-entry failed and why
why within the past hour, another instrument which serves as something of a compass went down. 2 other compasses are working. Columbia can land without these instruments that have gone out of operation, but NASA is anxious to determine what's causing the problems before the orbiter is returned to Earth. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
I think it was upside jet.
It was 5 a.m. Columbia was firing its big rocket thrusters, and 2 of 4 general-purpose computers failed. The orbiter was jolted. Young, for a brief moment, said there was no guidance or navigation, and it felt like the computers came back online just for a minute, and they were hit with 19 Gs.
I have no problems with it. We're in attitude on the verniers, and I selected tail-only jets just to make sure. I think it was up-firing jets that made these things fail. I really do.
It wasn't the only problem. Plans to land at 4:17 this afternoon were scrubbed when pilot Brewster Shaw reported that 1 of 3 inertial measurement units that tells Columbia where it is had failed too.
Okay, John, we still think that the IMU-1 or the GPC-1 and GPC-2 failures are associated with firings of forward jets. It's probably not likely, but it's possible the IMU problem was also associated with that.
There are redundant machines for both of these failures, but it's understanding what happened that's so important. Apparently important enough to get the orbiter program managers, even the director of the Johnson Space Center, Jerry Griffin, inside mission control the past hour. The landing is scheduled right now for 5:55 this afternoon on the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base. Weather is now a bit of a concern. If they scrub today, tomorrow morning may be their last good opportunity, according to Mother Nature. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
NBC News. This is Cameron Swayze reporting. Columbia is now shooting for a landing later today after a wave-off this morning. The latest on the mission from correspondent Jay Barbary at Cape Canaveral.
The Shuttle 9 astronauts are down to 1 landing opportunity today before California's Edwards Air Force Base is covered with nightfall. They are now shooting for a 6:50 p.m. Eastern Time touchdown, while computer analysts and mission control try to discover why 2 of Columbia's 5 general-purpose computers failed this morning when the crew fired the space plane's rocket thrusters in preparation for re-entry. The astronauts managed to get one of the failed computers working and dumped its memory to the ground for analyses. Mission control said the dump did not provide an obvious answer to what caused the failure. The high-tech space shuttle must have at least 1 computer to fly. It cannot be flown manually. Jay Barbary, NBC News, Cape Canaveral.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause. President of Columbia and its 6 astronauts are due to return to Earth in about 4 hours from now. Their re-entry was delayed by a computer failure and the breakdown of a navigational device. Space officials say the men are in no danger. They will land at Edwards Air Force Base in California as originally planned.
3 computers on Columbia is broken. So too is 1 of 3 machines that tells Columbia where it is and how fast it's going, and nobody knows why they failed, or whether it's tied to the jolt the orbiter took when it fired some of its 800-pound thrusters early this morning. The Payload Bay Doors are closed now, but if the problems with the computer and the IMUs aren't enough, there's a problem with the machine that gives messages to the crew.
Houston, Columbia, over.
Roger, go ahead, Houston, Columbia.
Roger, we got no paper and no message received off the telepair, over.
Roger, copy that. Columbia, Houston, we will try to send that message up to you again at Ascension.
Okay, my message is we are out of paper, Houston.
Even though it's a mystery, Mission Control preparing to get the shuttle back today. The landing now scheduled for 5:47 Houston time, Edwards Air Force Base, California. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney. Of circling the airport, the 6 Columbia astronauts have been circling the Earth all afternoon. Their landing delayed by malfunctioning computers and a bum navigation system. Mission Control in Houston says the problems can be overcome by the space shuttle's backup systems and a little help from the ground, so landing on that dry California lake bed should come just under 3 hours from now.
Has now concluded that a sudden jolt that hit Columbia this morning was unrelated to the failure of 2 onboard computers in Columbia. The word was passed up to the crew just a few minutes ago.
We do not think it was related to thruster firings, John.
Just have to be at the same time is all.
I know, and the entire team here on the ground has been looking at it in detail, and that's the overall summary of what we think, John.
Okay, good.
They're checking out the computers right now. One of the computers that broke down this morning was checked out just a few minutes ago. It was given a clean bill of health. That came as good news to the crew. Now, later on this afternoon, they're going to test the very same jets that gave them a problem earlier this morning, the jets that caused the delay in the landing. They're going to find out whether those jets will induce yet another problem inside the computers. The answer to that question will be coming up later on this afternoon. NASA has not set the exact time for that test, but the landing is scheduled for 5:47 this afternoon. Wayne Dolcefino and I will have live coverage of the landing here on KTRH. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause. It looks like a go for the delayed return of Space Shuttle Columbia, carrying the Space Lab and 6 astronauts. We have 2 reports. First, Jackie Judd in Houston.
Columbia has just over one more orbit around the globe before it glides down on a lakebed runway at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Experts here have not determined what caused a computer and a navigational device to fail earlier, but Mission Control says no difficulties are expected during re-entry and landing. Both instruments have backup systems without any loss of data coming into the spacecraft or being sent back to Earth. In just about an hour, a critical phase begins, the deorbit burn. Commander John Young and pilot Brewster Shaw will briefly turn Columbia tail first and fire the orbital maneuvering system engines. That slows down the spacecraft for its fiery re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. If all goes well, Columbia will touch down in less than 2 hours. My colleague Christopher Glenn has more from Edwards Air Force Base.
It is getting close, Jackie, and the last hour will find the descending spacecraft out of touch with the ground for a longer period of time than before. The track of the final orbit lies out of range of ground stations for nearly half a world. It's expected communications won't be resumed until they're close to the U.S. Pacific coast. Columbia will be coming into the lakebed runway here at Edwards from the north, a new direction of approach. But NASA's Ralph Jackson says it will be no hassle.
It's a different approach than what they've practiced in the simulators. However, it's a standard aircraft approach, and I'm sure John Young can handle it without any problem.
Astronaut Bob Crippen is flying weather watch here today. He reports a great afternoon for a landing. Our weather is go at Edwards, was his comment. I'm Chris Glenn, CBS News, Edwards Air Force Base.
Has just radioed the Space Shuttle astronauts the go-ahead to fire up Columbia's main engines for the return to Earth. Now, one of the 2 crucial computers that malfunctioned this morning is now back at work. Another is still down. The others, NASA believes, are working just fine. And Mission Control just minutes ago radioed the crew a set of emergency instructions telling them how to rearrange their computers to minimize the technical damage should another one go down during re-entry. This way, another computer failure would still allow a return to Earth. But still unsolved this afternoon is another problem, a failure with one of the 3 machines that tells the shuttle where it is and how fast it's going. Columbia's crew has been told it should stay in orbit if another one of those gyroscope-like devices fails. Meanwhile, here on Earth, the rituals of landing are underway. Astronaut Bob Crippen flying a shuttle training craft over the lakebed at Edwards Air Force Base.
I was just going to give you a rundown on some winds, if you can copy.
Roger, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Calm on the surface. Weather is go at Edwards.
So the big Payload Bay Doors are now closed. The shuttle crew has been given the go-ahead to fire up its engines over the Indian Ocean and plummet into the searing heat of re-entry into the atmosphere. Wayne Dolcefino and I will return throughout the afternoon with updates on this delayed landing of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News. Well, Columbia's crew is now on its own, and Columbia should be committed to re-entry. crucial 700-pound maneuvering engines were fired up, or when they were fired up. There is no telling right now whether reentry is going as expected. The 4 remaining computers have been rearranged, so to speak, to minimize the damage if another one of the computers goes down. Now, should the shuttle lose another computer, it is possible that one of the Columbia's big main engines, the one that should have been fired just a few minutes ago, will have failed. But the crew could still return to Earth in that event. There is one other possibility this afternoon, though. One of the emergency plans radioed up to Columbia a few minutes ago told Commander John Young to stay in orbit an extra day if the shuttle loses another one of its gyroscope-like devices that tell it where it is and how fast it's traveling. And so one of those inertial maneuvering units failed earlier today. There are 2 left at this point. Both of them are still working at last report from the crew. So once again, Columbia is now on its own. It's out of touch with mission control for another 33 minutes or so. Everyone here at NASA is waiting for word on whether the shuttle is truly plummeting back into the atmosphere for a return home. So once again, at this point, we're looking at the deorbit burn, as it's called, who have fired just a few minutes ago. And we're looking for the possibility of some communications around 5:30 this afternoon. Wayne Dolcefino and I will be here throughout the afternoon with a landing scheduled at 5:47 this evening. We'll be carrying that live here on KTRH. And of course, as the mission merits, if anything comes up this afternoon, we'll have updates continuously all through the afternoon to tell you exactly what's going on with this now long delayed landing of the Space Shuttle Columbia. It's coming in at this moment. So we'll have updates through the afternoon here on KTRH as the progress of Columbia as it flies into the atmosphere here on KTRH Houston.
CBS News, I'm Dallas Townsend. After a delay of nearly 8 hours caused by a computer failure, the Space Shuttle Columbia is now committed to return to Earth about 47 minutes from now at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where Christopher Glenn is standing by.
Because the mission had to be extended, Columbia is tracking an unfamiliar path as it drops hotly back into the Earth's atmosphere. Mission Control described the route and a longer than usual communications blackout.
Up over the eastern coastline of Asia, China, and the Soviet Union, then down over the Aleutians, and we'll reacquire the tracking data relay satellite only very shortly before actually coming into the U.S.
When Columbia does pass the coast, 80 miles north of San Francisco, it'll be traveling 9.5 times the speed of sound, and the sharp double crack of the sonic boom should track right down the San Joaquin Valley. Despite the fact that the final approach is from the opposite direction than previous landings, NASA officials say it's a standard approach maneuver, and John Young, the nation's most space-traveled astronaut, should have no problem with it. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, Edwards Air Force Base.
Columbia is finally coming home. Its return to Earth delayed nearly 8 hours because of serious problems earlier this morning with computer failures and jolts to the orbiter from the 800-pound rocket thruster. We are expecting the end of the communications blackout at any second now. For the Commander John Young, this day began at 10 o'clock last night. It went smoothly as Spacelab was deactivated. Its experiments tucked away.
Data through the tracking data relay satellite. Orbiter at Mach 15.
So the orbiter is committed. It's coming in right now. Apparently the deorbit burn has gone fine. That's something everyone was worried about on this flight. We're trying to find out whether or not it's traveling at 167,000 feet at this moment. The Commander John Young, the day began about 10 o'clock last night. The experiments all tucked away. Columbia was configuring its general-purpose computers and firing its big rockets that keep the craft aligned when something happened. 2 computers failed this morning, and even the veteran astronaut John Young was shaken.
I don't know how, but it was really an impact type thing, probably high magnitude than we've seen around here in a long time, and maybe somebody can look at the thruster traces and say what it was, but it seemed that way. It looks like to me that GPC-1 is hard failed and GPC-2 is okay.
We got a big X-pole fail right at the firing.
This is what we believe. We're now on vernier jets, like I say, and we got tail-only jet fail, and when we go to Op 3, I recommend we select, we close the forward RCS and not burn any more of those rascals.
I think it was the up-firing jets that made these things fail. I really do. It really hit the vehicle hard.
Then one of 3 inertial measurement units that help Columbia know where it is in space and how fast it's going failed. The deorbit was delayed again.
The tension was probably bad enough. Mission Control trying to refigure the computers while the crew has more to think about its reentry. Then the commander reported that he could not receive messages on the teletype any longer.
The commands were called out during the last communications through the tracking satellite because he had run out of paper in the teletype machine. Before the scheduled deorbit ignition, the last contact about 20 minutes before the communications blackout, Mission Control was giving the crew its options if something went wrong.
When the next IMU fails, go around for 1 day if you cannot ID the failed IMU. If you have GPC2 down, you lose the left ohms because of TVC. If you lose GPC4 down, you lose the right ohms because you don't get ignition.
Columbia now 425 nautical miles out, now traveling at 10 times the speed of sound.
And Columbia is plummeting southward toward the coast, 80 miles north of San Francisco, traveling more than 10 times the speed of sound at this point, 425 nautical miles away from landing, 160,000 feet above the ground. Now, Young's pilot on the shuttle mission 1, the maiden flight of Columbia, Bob Crippen, has been flying in the skies around the dry lake bed, checking out the weather, which is one thing that has played havoc all day long.
They're talking to the crew.
Roger that. We're reading you loud and clear.
The first voice communication from the Space Shuttle Columbia as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere.
We are expecting the end of the communications blackout. You just heard it a moment ago. Columbia now traveling out of touch for just about 15 minutes. Its thermal protection system has been taking the fiery heat of re-entry, the orange glow. Temperatures up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Commander Young and pilot Brewster Shaw in the cockpit. Mission specialist Bob Parker, Owen Garriott, the scientist Uwe Mirbold, and Brian Lichtenberg in the middeck. The ammonia boilers on board Columbia should now be activated. The computers cooling the ship. Columbia, as we said, crossing the coast north of San Francisco, traveling directly over Fresno, California. They should get a good sonic boom. Columbia now traveling at 8 times the speed of sound. They'll be traveling 30 miles east of Bakersfield over the Mojave Desert, coming southward to the lake bed.
And Columbia's navigation system now communicating with the navigation system on the ground, the TACAN, Tactical Communication System, now communicating with Columbia itself. So, in effect, the computers on the ground are talking to the computers in the air. Columbia is sailing home for a landing at Edwards Air Force Base.
This morning's problems have not dampened the enthusiasm at all over the great work of this crew of Spacelab during 12-hour shifts the past 10 days. Columbia have been traveling more than 4 million miles, 130 miles up in space. A lot of history made the past week or so, proving some theories, disproving some other theories, some theories 77 years old. New metals were created. We learned more about why plants grow upward, how stars evolve, how to make perfect crystals. This morning, the crew received some thank yous from the ground. A message from Harry Kraft, the Spacelab program manager.
I'm assuming that the eagle that Tom will be coming in, he is pretty much coming over Lake Isabella. Is that affirmative?
Roger, Crip, he'd be right between Isabella and Bakersfield and coming down from Fresno.
I don't believe that area of clouds is really going to be a factor. They're pretty much concentrated in the Lake Isabella area.
He says all of us in Marshall Space Lab operations, the cadre, the management team, the experimenters, want to express our appreciation to the crew of Columbia and Space Lab 1 for the absolutely superb jobs you have done.
We're delighted to be here, and we certainly appreciate the messages from the various heads of state and ministers of those countries. I think it is important that we cooperate internationally, not only in space, but everywhere else. And we're anxiously awaiting to get back to the Earth so we can see just exactly what scientific and technical accomplishments have been achieved and report them. It's been an exciting 10 days, and I think we've learned a whole lot about how to live, operate, and work in space in this delightful environment. Not only just a little bit, but 24 hours a day for 10 days straight. And we think that we've accomplished about what we set out to do, learned about what humans could do in space in the Columbia and in the Space Lab. Both vehicles have performed in a truly outstanding manner. I can only say that the crew that I'm associated with, I'm so proud of them. I can't believe it because they have truly performed, each and every one of them, in every way possible, just beautifully. And I think we're going to be very pleased with the results of this mission when we start analyzing all the data.
And the scientific achievements were incredible. Enough data to fill up 18,000 books a second was the brag around here at NASA. The paper, they said, would stretch all the way to the moon and back. Some scientists knew right away what their experiments had found out, and they could not, at times, control their excitement. Listen to Italian scientist Luigi Napolitano.
Thanks a lot. Thanks an awful lot. You're a great guy, a great scientist, a great experimenter, a great astronaut. A great European, let me say that too.
Columbia now just about 100,000 feet above the Earth. Any minute now should be going into terminal area energy management maneuvers, basically trying to dissipate some of the energy as Columbia drops 200, 300 feet per second, coming down to runway 17, the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base, California. We're just about 7.5 minutes away from the scheduled touchdown on the runway in California. And you know, Doug Miller, it will be decades before some of the scientific achievements are known from this flight. During another first this week, a 5-satellite teleconference between the crew of Spacelab and the President, Ronald Reagan, who was beaming like a proud papa.
The high-tech spin-offs of our space effort are too numerous to list. The experiments on this shuttle mission will add to the treasury of human knowledge and be put to practical use, improving our lives right here on Earth. This mission is also a shining example of international cooperation at its best. The space lab we've just toured was a gift to the United States from our European friends. Building on that goodwill, this is the first time a citizen from another country has joined one of our space missions as a member of the crew. It is an exciting first.
And right now we just got the first sight of the shuttle Columbia moving in over Edwards Air Force Base tonight. We're looking at a bright sunset over there. About 40,000 people gathered on the ground, and they're catching the first sight of Columbia as it moves in. They've got 3 good auxiliary power units, those little power packs that caused so many problems on previous flights. Everything looking just fine considering all the problems we had this morning, traveling at 2.5 times the speed of sound.
Now traveling at 2.5 times the speed of sound, Columbia is basically a piece of white metal in the sky. Clear skies over Edwards Air Force Base, California. Now at 78,000 feet, Mach 2.3. Columbia approaching subsonic velocity any moment now.
Dropping at the rate of about 200 feet per second. John Young's going to have to pull off a very tricky maneuver because of the steep angle at which the Columbia is coming in over the coast from the northern perspective. It's going to have to shift at 309 degrees on what they call the heading alignment cylinder, the curve they make to come in toward the runway to line themselves up to roll down. It's going to be a very, very tight maneuver, something never been done in a shuttle before. And, of course, Wayne Dolcefino, it's being done with the heaviest payload ever landed in any space shuttle, the heavy space lab back there. It's going to cause them quite a test of John Young's flying capabilities.
Space Lab weighs 33,000 pounds, and of course its landing weight will be 220,000 pounds, about 12,000 pounds heavier than any other space shuttle mission in the past. Just about 5 minutes before touchdown now of the space shuttle Columbia. Now dropping at 320 feet per second. Now 300 miles. I tell you one thing that's going to be interesting, Doug Miller, is how tired this crew is once they get back.
Yes, and John Young has been up for something like 18 hours now. I mean, he's been up since, well, most of us were asleep early in the morning. He hasn't had much sleep at all, and there has been some concern as to whether or not John Young would be just too tired to fly this thing in. He may have caught a nap this afternoon because they were talking about coming in on this orbit as opposed to the early orbit. They were hoping he could catch a little bit of shut-eye. There's no word on whether he did. Right now, looking at the scene from Edwards Air Force Base, the shuttle now firing off a couple of its control thrusters. Right now, we can see jets of white streams coming out of the back of the shuttle, that tight curve they're going to move into shortly. They're 4 minutes, 15 seconds away from landing. And we can see at this point the wings of the shuttle, the outline of the shuttle silhouetted against the sky, and the sun glinting against the body of the shuttle Columbia, the white streak across the sky, and now it's visible from the ground itself. 50,000 feet above the dry lake bed, traveling at 180 feet per second, 26 miles out from the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base.
John Young is expected to come home along with Brewster Shaw, the pilot, back to Houston at Ellington Air Force Base. We assume, although they're probably very tired guys, there's a chance they might stay in California. The mission specialists and the scientists still have a lot of work to do, Doug.
That's right. As a matter of fact, it's not over for them at all. As a matter of fact, they're going to be feeling weightlessness shortly, in a few days. They're going to go through a few more medical experiments. They're going to be passing through some experiments identical to those that were on the space lab itself. They're going to be taking tests to find out possibly possibly the cause and maybe the cure for space sickness. They're going to be there for at least another week now, so it's going to be a week before the 4 payload specialists can come home from this flight.
Columbia now dropping 280 feet per second, now at subsonic velocity, basically plummeting toward the Earth. It appears like it's coming straight down toward the ground, the dry lake bed.
And the first sonic boom just heard on the ground. And now the Columbia is coming around on its heading alignment curve. That's the curve that it is making to line its way up on the runway itself. A very, very tight curve. That's that tight maneuver we were talking about just a moment ago, Wayne.
John Young will be looking out the window. Right now they are flying this bird themselves. John Young, Brewster Shaw.
Traveling at a rate of 290 feet per second now. It's falling just straight down at the ground, like we say, straight down at the ground. We're seeing different angles from the jets that are flying alongside.
Well, the chase planes, the T-38s.
Right.
Of course, Bob Crippen has been up looking at the weather, and his weather word was very good. In fact, it's a lot clearer in California than we thought it would be.
Right now, one of the jets that's flying alongside, one of the chase planes, passing right behind the Space Shuttle Columbia, providing a rather spectacular view for the people on the ground here in Mission Control, watching over their television monitors.
Oh, in fact, it's right over to the side, right alongside Columbia, the chase plane. They could probably see inside the cockpit from the angle they are, flying right alongside the shuttle, and obviously that has to be a good sight for John Young and Bob Crippen. They are now pre-final.
We're traveling at 128 feet per second, traveling 10 miles out from the landing site itself. About 40,000 people waiting to see them on the ground. But, you know, the people in Mission Control right now, Wayne, I think are getting the best view of all from this chase plane that's flying closer to the Space Shuttle than we've ever seen before.
It's an awful lot better of a shot, and it would be interesting to see as to whether or not that chase plane is taking a picture at the orbiter to see whether or not they had any damage. There are some very dark brown looking material on the back side of the orbiter, Doug. If you can see on the orbital maneuvering system pods in the back, almost looks like a burn. It's almost an orange color on the back end.
Winds are calm.
Which makes you wonder what that banging and popping noise or what that jolt was that felt earlier today.
7 miles from runway.
We're getting a sight of Columbia from the runway. It looks like Columbia heading right straight for the runway.
On center line and on glide slope.
Heading right down the stripe right now. That is heading right in toward the stripe.
Less than a minute away from the touchdown of the Space Shuttle Columbia. As we said, this has been a very long mission, almost 10 days, the longest Space Shuttle mission in history.
Columbia on its final approach to the runway, 5 miles out.
Everything looking just great. It's surprising. Everything's going fine. You know, we've always said if they got anything down, it's the landing.
5,000
pulling
feet.
it off. 5,000 feet out. We're listening to the voice of Steve Nesbitt inside Mission Control.
And as Space Shuttle Columbia lands, it will be landing on the runway, and alongside at the hangar, the Space Shuttle Discovery.
And, of course, the museum piece sitting there, Enterprise. The museum piece put out to pasture there, the one that's never flown in space, which may fly someday. 3 shuttles, past, present, and future, landing at Edwards Air Force Base.
We're approaching the runway.
Flight control mode. Commander John Young controlling the vehicle.
Coming to touchdown. We got the sight of Columbia.
Flare.
And now the landing gear coming down as Columbia moves in toward the runway.
Landing gear looking good. Columbia now 30 feet above the ground. The nose up slightly. 20 feet. 15, 10, 5. Waiting for those back wheels to touch down. Kicking up dust on the runway. The back wheels down.
The rear wheels are down, but the front gear not yet. Still coasting along with the rear wheels, the front gear still up in the air. It's unusually long time for those front gears.
Taking a while to pull it down, Doug.
It's coming down very, very slowly now at Edwards Air Force Base. And the main gear is down, a bumpy landing there. But the Space Shuttle Columbia has landed after more than a 7-hour delay.
Just about 8 hours. In fact, they should have by now been back in Houston. John Young and Brewster Shaw probably would have been asleep right now, back at their homes here in Houston. Instead, they're still in California. We don't know exactly what the plans are. We do know that the mission specialists and the payload specialists are going to stay there. Whether or not they're going to bring John Young, Brewster Shaw back to Houston tonight to Ellington Air Force Base, we don't know yet, of course. As soon as we do, we'll let you know. Columbia now rolling to a stop. And Doug, you can see a lot more clearly now that burning looking, basically looks like a piece of plastic after you light a match next to it.
That's right. It looks like a burned brown, sort of like setting sugar on fire. The Columbia now at a complete stop on the runway there at Edwards Air Force Base, and we're not hearing anything at all out of the crew. No cheers, nothing at all. Great landing is the word.
The crew in the orbiter now throwing switches in the post-landing positions.
For up to the checklist.
John Young, Brewster Shaw, the pilot, they did a good job, Doug Miller. They are on the ground now. Columbia has returned after 10 days, just about 4.5 million miles of space travel. Now the problems are behind them, although I imagine in the next few weeks there's going to be an awful lot of investigation as to exactly what happened this morning.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we're going to have a briefing tonight around 7 o'clock to try to find out what NASA's speculation is on what caused that computer problem today. 2 computers failing at one time. Actually, 2 computers failing after 2 rocket bursts, 2 rocket maneuvers that were pulled off earlier this morning. No one seems to know here on the ground exactly what happened, although they did radio up to the crew of the Columbia that they don't believe that the jolt that they felt, that the rocket firings are related to the computer problems they experienced. But no one is explaining right now what the problem was aboard Columbia. Nobody seems to know.
The convoys now heading over to the Space Shuttle Columbia on the ground at the dry lake bed in California, and it was really a pretty landing. The glow of the runway, the sun setting in California just about 30 minutes from now. The runway had a bronze look to it, and it was a beautiful landing indeed. Columbia is standing still. The convoy approaching to purge the systems to make sure there's no radiation. We can see the trucks approaching Columbia right now. I'm Wayne Dolcefino, along with Doug Miller. You've been listening to live coverage of the return of Columbia and the end of Space Shuttle Mission 9.
This is The World Tonight. Good evening, I'm Doug Poling, CBS News, sitting in for Douglas Edwards. It came in about 8 hours late, thanks to a computer breakdown, but the Space Shuttle Columbia has touched down safely at Edwards Air Force Base. We have 2 reports, first from Chris Glenn.
Columbia has returned to Earth again. Columbia has returned to Earth again, carrying the record-shattering 6-man crew and Space Lab to a safe and precise landing on a beautiful desert afternoon. The flight's final day may have been plagued with some pesky computer and guidance system problems, but John Young guided the spacecraft to a diving, swooping landing on the dusty dry lake bed runway. They had followed a new path home because of the extension of the flight earlier today by several orbits. The final orbit brought them in from the north rather than the usual southern approach. The new pattern required some new maneuvers, but it didn't seem to be a bit of a problem for John Young. An appreciative crowd, smaller than in missions past, oohed and awed as the twin sonic booms of the approaching spacecraft cracked across the desert, and they cheered mightily when the wheels touched the lakebed runway. But what looked like a perfect landing had a glitch.
GPC 2 failed when we nose wheel hit the ground. I don't want to say anything, but it did.
A GPC is a general-purpose computer, and indeed, computer problems earlier in the day had forced the extension of the flight. At that time, it was theorized the shock of firing some maneuvering jets might have caused it to conk out. Now the shock of landing seems to have triggered a similar problem. But they are home, the 6, and they are safe, and the accomplishments of Space Lab will not be soon forgotten. Christopher Glenn, CBS News, at Edwards Air Force Base.
This is Jackie Judd at the Johnson Space Center. This final day of the mission was very long and difficult for the astronauts and for ground controllers. The problems began early this morning, several hours before the first scheduled landing. Commander John Young fired a thruster jet, and moments later, one of 4 computers used to guide Columbia went down.
My feeling is that it was outside thrusters that failed both those GPCs, and I don't know how, but it was really an impact type thing, probably higher magnitude than we've seen around here in a long time. It really hit the vehicle hard.
The landing was delayed so experts on the ground could figure out what happened. All they can say now is it does not appear to be the jet firing that triggered the computer failure. Why a navigation device failed also is a puzzle. There was one last annoying problem. Mission Control had to relay all final commands verbally because the teleprinter on Columbia that receives messages ran out of paper. One planning detail someone obviously overlooked when deciding to extend this mission. Jackie Judd, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.